scalable, secure, and allow for rich user experience.
It's no wonder. It's the choice of leading companies.
For your final project, you will complete a beautiful professional website for your portfolio, complete with interactivity to showcase during your job search.
You'll also be ready to collaborate with other developers as you will have learned to use Git and GitHub for version control.
If you're hoping to operate independently or in a smaller team, not to worry. We've also got you covered when it comes to the basics of user experience.
You'll learn how to research a user's needs, create wireframes using popular industry tools like Figma, and design interactivity.
In the final course, you will prepare for the coding interview. You'll practice your interview skills, refine your resume, and tackle some common coding challenges that typically form part of technical job interviews.
Once you complete the program, you'll get access to the Meta Career Program's job board,
a job search platform that connects you with over 200 employers who have committed to sourcing talent through Meta certificate programs.
Who knows where you will end up? Whatever the future of connection looks like, you'll be part of its creation. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to this course on HTML and CSS. Every day when you browse the internet, you're interacting with HTML and CSS code. By now, you probably know a little bit about how that works. And if you're taking this course, you want to find out even more. That's great. There will be a short overview of HTML and CSS just after this introduction. But first, let's briefly go through what you'll be doing in this course. You'll start off by learning how HTML is used in the real world. This includes learning about semantic and meta tags and the importance of having a structured approach so that you can create well-formed web pages. Next up are user input and forms, and in this part of the course, you will create and test a form by yourself. You will learn about advanced input types, how to validate input and provide feedback to improve the user experience of a form. But what would the web be without media? The next HTML section will focus on bringing websites to life with media elements. You will learn how to embed video and audio players and even iframes. Following the module about HTML is one all about CSS. This part of the course will go beyond basic styling. You will learn how to create layouts with grids and flexboxes. You will also learn about CSS selectors and how you can combine them to refine the styling of elements on your web pages. Not only that, but you'll also learn how to use pseudo-class selectors to improve the interactivity of a web page. But there's even more. You will learn how to add effects on web pages using purely CSS, and you will cover basic transform and transition animations, as well as more advanced animations using keyframes. Next, you will learn how to use browser developer tools and UI testing to debug HTML and CSS code. The final part of the module is about the graded assessment. For this assessment, you will build a homepage for a fictional company, and you'll get an opportunity to review your classmates' projects as well, since this is a peer-graded assignment. There are many videos in the course that will gradually guide you towards your goal of becoming a developer. Watch, pause, rewind, and re-watch the videos until you are confident in your skills. Then consolidate your knowledge by consulting the course readings and putting your skills into practice during the course exercises. Along the way, you'll encounter several knowledge quizzes where you can self-check your progress. And remember, you're not alone in considering a career as a developer, which is why you'll also work with course discussion prompts that help you to connect with your classmates. It's a great way to share knowledge, discuss difficulties, and grow a network of contacts in the web development world. You have probably encountered a few new words and technical terms in this video. Don't worry if you don't fully understand all these terms right now. Everything will become clearer soon. After all, this is part of the reason why you're taking this course. The average person doesn't know much about what happens behind the scenes when they browse the internet on their phone or computer. But as an aspiring developer, you are aware of how the content on screen is controlled by HTML and CSS. And by now you know that HTML is a markup language used to create web pages. In fact, it's the most basic and fundamental language for creating web pages. And together with CSS, it has helped the web browser expand beyond just desktop computers. HTML has been around since 1990, and it was originally designed to provide a way for people to share information over the internet. HTML web pages used to only show basic images and text. The websites you browse today are very different. This is because HTML can do much more than just defining how content is displayed in the browser. HTML is great, but together with CSS, it can do so much more. CSS is a style sheet language that is used to describe the look and layout of a document written in HTML. While CSS is not a programming language, it does allow for some programming-like features such as variables and nested rules. And what it does is give you control over color, size, spacing, fonts, positioning, and more. One of the fundamental principles of CSS is the separation of content and style. That means you can change a web page's appearance without editing its underlying HTML. W3C, the organization responsible for standards for the World Wide Web, manages both HTML and CSS specifications. They continually improve their capabilities to ensure that they are always oriented towards current requirements. Many new features were added to the current version of HTML that make it easier to use than previous versions. These are better support for multimedia content, such as audio and video, improved support for responsive design, such as adapting the web page layout depending on the device the web page is viewed on, new form input types such as sliders and range inputs, date and color pickers, new form validation features, and new ways to work with text, such as spell checking and text editing. Some major additions released for CSS in 2011 ensure that CSS can style and control a website regardless of the media content or the device used for viewing the page. The additions to the current version are media queries, which allow for different styles to be applied depending on the device being used, box sizing, which allows developers to specify how they want their content to be sized and padded, multiple backgrounds, which mean you can specify multiple background images for an element, border images, which allow developers to specify an image as a border instead of a solid color or style, text shadows, which mean you can add shadows behind text for a more three-dimensional look, and transformations and transitions, which allow developers to animate elements on a web page. In essence, the combination of HTML and CSS allows websites to adapt their design and layout based on the devices on which they're viewed. While this feature was initially used to support mobile devices like cell phones and tablets, the usage of HTML and CSS has grown beyond the traditional web browser and web pages. Today, web pages can be viewed not only on computers, cell phones and tablets, but also on video game consoles and even smart TVs. The web browser has truly expanded beyond traditional desktop devices, and it's all thanks to the combination of HTML and CSS. Perhaps you know a little about HTML and CSS from another course you did, or perhaps you don't know much at all. Either way, a quick summary will be useful, so let's explore some basic HTML and CSS principles and practices. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, but what does that mean? Hypertext is text which contains links to other text. Markup refers to tags and elements used within a document. HTML elements with their opening and closing tags in angle brackets make up a HTML document. These elements form the structure of a web page and describe what to display to the web browser. When it comes to HTML, it's important to know about the purpose of HTML in the web browser, the use of HTML tags and correct syntax, and how HTML elements are used in a web document. But what can you do with HTML? You can add images to a web page with HTML code. You can use it to display data in tables, and you can build forms with a wide range of inputs. Also, using the correct HTML structure and appropriate elements as a foundation is an essential part of building accessible websites. HTML can assist in ensuring web accessibility by supporting the technology people with disabilities use to interact with and understand websites. Another important concept to know about when you're talking about HTML is the Document Object Model, or DOM. Users need to be able to interact with elements on a web page. This means that a HTML document must be represented in a way that JavaScript code can query and update it. And that's the function of the DOM. It's a model of the objects in your HTML file. And web developers interact with the DOM through JavaScript to update content, set up events, and animate HTML elements. Now that you've covered the basics of HTML, let's move on to CSS, or cascading style sheets. If HTML is the frame and structure of a building, then CSS is the paint, wallpaper, fixtures, and overall style. CSS tells the web browser how to display HTML elements on screen. You use CSS to style elements within a HTML document, create an appealing layout for your web page using the box model, and arrange page elements using normal document flow. And that was your HTML and CSS refresher. Now get ready to dive deeper into learning more about these two topics. By now you know that HTML describes the content of a web page, but how do you describe the meaning of a web page? To understand this in a real-world context, think of buttons in an elevator. The vertical arrangement of buttons isn't enough for someone to understand their meaning. To convey the meaning or semantics of the buttons, numbers are added so that people know which button will take them to which floor. When you write HTML, it's good practice to semantically describe the content. This allows search engines and accessibility software, such as screen readers, to understand the contents of a page. Fortunately, you can do this by using some basic HTML tags. For example, using a heading tag such as H1 describes that the content is a heading. Similarly, the UL and OL tags describe lists. However, there are many more semantic HTML elements available to you as a developer. In this video, I will share a structured approach you can take to make sure that you create a well-formed web page. Let's revisit the basic structure of a HTML page, which includes the head and body. Inside the body tag, you can lay out the website with various semantic tags to describe each of the sections. For a typical HTML page, the structure can be semantically described using the header, main, and footer semantic HTML tags. For example, suppose you lay out your page with a header section that contains some company logo and navigation links. Then a main section contains sections and articles. Finally, a footer section contains contact information and social media links. The main navigation section of your web page can also be described semantically using the nav tag. Depending on how a web page is designed, the nav element is often placed after the header element, and the header element is used for logos. The main links of your website are then added inside the nav element. It is common practice for developers to specify their links as an unordered list inside the nav element. Next is the main content of a web page. The two key semantic elements for your main content are the article and section elements. First, let's examine the article element. The HTML specification states that, according to the World Wide Web Consortium's website, the article element indicates content which represents a complete or self-contained composition in a document, page, application, or site that is independently distributable. That's quite a mouthful. It may help to think of a page in a newspaper. There are many articles on the page, and you can cut out the individual articles with scissors if you want to. The articles you can remove are like the article element. Examples of this include a forum post, a magazine or newspaper article, a blog entry, a user-submitted comment, an interactive widget or gadget, or any other independent item of content. Let's examine how the article element is used. Say you are developing a blog about your summer holiday. It's good practice to contain the blog post content inside of the article element because it's a complete self-contained composition on a web page. You should place the article element within your main element. Then you add your regular heading and paragraph tags inside the article element. The reason for doing it this way is because the main element semantically represents the main content of the page. And inside of it, there can be multiple article elements for something like a blog post list. At the end of your document is the footer element. This might contain additional navigation links or other content. It is important to note that semantic elements are not limited to this structure. Since their purpose is to describe the semantics of the content, the elements can be nested inside of each other if it accurately describes the content. Let's update the previous example to use a nested semantic structure. You add a header element to the article element. Inside the header element, add the heading element with the blog title and a paragraph element describing the date and author of the blog post. Inside the main element, add the content of the blog post. That's it. Let's examine the section element. You can add a section element to semantically define individual sections of the article. It is important to note that sections should contain heading elements to semantically describe the section. It is also possible to use section elements to describe different sections of your web page. The section element doesn't require the article element. It all depends on how you want to semantically describe your page. And now you know how to semantically describe the contents of a web page. Your web page is more accessible because the content is semantically described to add meaning. Now, search engines and accessibility software can easily understand the contents of your well-formed web page.
The Little Lemon restaurant has asked me to add a new blog page to their website. They've told me that the page will contain several blog posts and that it must use semantic HTML so that search engines and accessibility software can understand the semantics of the page. I've set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named blog.html. I'll start off by adding my basic semantic structure. First, I add the header element, followed by the nav element, followed by the main element, followed by the footer element. Remember, this structure describes the semantics of this HTML document. Specifically, the header element will be used to display the Little Lemon logo, and the nav element will be used to describe the navigational structure of the website. The main element will feature the main content of the web page, and the footer will be used to display copyright information. When a search engine or accessibility software reads this document, the semantic tags will help the software understand the purpose and meaning of different sections of the document. I will now add the details to each element. Inside the header element, I add the Little Lemon logo using the image tag. Inside the nav element, I add the navigation links in an unordered list element using the UL tag. I then add 3 list item elements using the LI tag. Inside the list items, I add the hyperlinks for index.html, location.html, and blog.html using the anchor tag. In the main element, I add an h1 tag for the blog heading. The restaurant told me that there will be 2 blog posts for their website, so I add 2 article elements after the h1 element. Inside the first article element, I add an h2 tag for the title of the blog post. The title is 20% off this weekend. I then add a paragraph element below the title, which contains the blog post text. Inside the second article element, I add an h2 tag for the title, which is Our New Menu. Again, I add a paragraph element below the title, which contains the blog post text. Finally, I add a paragraph element to the footer element. In this paragraph element, I add the copyright notice. The blog page is now semantically described through the HTML document. I now save the file by pressing Ctrl and S or Command and S on Mac. I then right-click the blog.html file and select Live Preview to preview the file. The blog page looks good, and all thanks to proper semantic design that ensures accessibility and search engine optimization. I'm sure that the Little Lemon restaurant will get lots of business through their blog, and their customers with disabilities will be able to access the blog with no problems.
When was the last time you used a search engine? Probably in the last few hours or minutes. Perhaps you just wanted to quickly look something up, or maybe you needed more in-depth information on a topic. Either way, the search engine you used will have returned a list of results that were most relevant to what you searched for. But how does a search engine determine which web pages are most relevant? In this video, you will learn how search engines analyze web pages and how meta tags help provide information for search engines. A major part of launching a website is a process called search engine optimization, or SEO. This process involves making improvements to a website's content, semantics, and delivery to improve its ranking in search results. You might be wondering, what exactly does a search engine do when it analyzes a web page? Well, when a search engine visits your website, it analyzes the HTML document and media content. If it finds a link to another HTML document, it follows the link to that document and continues following links until it has finished analyzing the entire website. Based on the results of the analysis and the content on your website, the search engine will rank the website for various search terms. So while your website might be the #1 result for one search term, it could rank very low for another. Every search engine has its own algorithm for ranking websites. And while it's not disclosed how the ranks are determined, there are many best practices you can follow to influence how search engines analyze and rank your website. But for now, let's just focus on how meta tags influence website ranking. Meta tags define metadata about a web page. What is metadata, you ask? It's data about other data, which in this case is data about the web page. Meta tags are added inside the head element of your HTML document. And as you know, nothing inside the head element is displayed in the web browser. In other words, meta tags are unseen elements within the browser. Note that there is no closing tag for the meta tag. The meta element has two attributes, name and content. The name attribute specifies the name of the metadata, and the content attribute specifies the value of the metadata. Let's examine some examples of metadata. The author metadata specifies the author of the web page. The name attribute is author, and the content attribute is the person and company who are the author of the web page. The description metadata describes the content of the web page. This is often used by search engines as descriptive text in search results. The name attribute is set to description, and the content attribute is the descriptive text. The keywords metadata was previously used to provide search keywords for search engines. However, this led to a lot of websites using the keywords metadata to manipulate search rankings. One of the major search engines now ignores this metadata, and another uses keywords metadata as a spam indicator. Because of this, it's recommended not to include this metadata in modern web pages. Another type of metadata is the robots metadata, and it tells search engines if and how they should analyze your web page. The name robots comes from the automated software, often referred to as bots, that search engines use to analyze websites. The content attribute for robots has 4 possible values. Index tells the bot to analyze the page. Follow tells the bot to also visit all links on the web page. No index tells the bot not to analyze the page. Some bots will ignore this, so it's best not to rely on this to stop bots from analyzing your page. And no follow tells the bot not to visit links on the web page. Again, some bots will ignore this value, so it's best not to rely on it. Finally, there's the viewport metadata. The viewport metadata is important when designing responsive web pages. Why, you might ask? Because when a web page is viewed on a phone or tablet, the device will by default attempt to render the web page as if it is being viewed on a desktop. This results in a poor browsing experience for the user. The solution is to define viewport metadata. There are many values available for viewport metadata. The most used value for the mobile experiences is to set the width to device-width and the initial scale to 1.0. You can learn more about viewports in the additional reading. It's important to note that viewport metadata does not solve all the issues with browsing websites on mobile devices. The other part of the solution is responsive web design. But we were talking about search engine optimization, right? Viewport metadata is important for the user experience, and it's also important for search engine optimization. This is because many search engines now include a website's mobile experience as a part of their ranking algorithms. There is more metadata that you can define on your web page to specifically improve its presence on social media, but that's for a later video. For now, it's important to know that author, description, keywords, robots, and viewport metadata all play a role in the search engine optimization of web pages. An important part of being a developer is not just the tools you use, such as your integrated development environment, but also the repository of knowledge and code templates you build up over time. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to one of these templates, which will help you get set up quickly for building web pages. Let's open Visual Studio Code to go through the template step by step. In the folder, we have index.html along with a JS folder and a CSS folder. Inside the JS folder, there is a file named script.js. There is no content in this file. It is added to this folder so that you can easily add JavaScript code to the web page. I recommend that you add any other JavaScript files to this folder too. Next, I'll open the CSS folder. In the folder, there's a file named styles.css. Again, there is no content in this file, but it is here so that you can easily add CSS rules to the web page. Again, it's best if you add any other CSS files also to this folder. I go back to my template folder and open it in Visual Studio Code. I open the index.html file. The file has a semantic HTML document structure set up. At the top, there is the doc type declaration followed by the HTML root element. Inside the root element, there are the head and body elements. In the head element, the title and meta tags are already optimized for search engines. I recommend that you update the title along with the description and author meta tags. Below are the meta tags for the Open Graph protocol. Don't worry about the details of these tags just yet, as you'll learn about them in a later video. For now, the main thing to know is that if you plan on sharing the web page on social media, you should remember to uncomment this HTML section and update the content attributes. The next block of commented out code is for icons. If you want to show an icon in the web browser tab for your website, you can update the href attributes here to point to your icon. Remember, you always link elements for the CSS style sheet to the last section of the head element. To speed things up for you, there is a link already set up to reference the styles.css file in the CSS folder. By now, you can probably see how useful this template is. Let's continue to the body element. The body element already contains a basic semantic structure. This includes the header element for your website title or logo, the nav element for your website navigation, the main element for your main content, and the footer element for any copyright notices or links to secondary web pages. Below the footer element, you add script elements for JavaScript files. To make your life easy, a script element is already set up to reference the script.js file in the JS folder. With this template, you'll be able to quickly start building out web pages. It's worth keeping a copy of this template on your local machine to use and reference in future projects. In this video, you've been introduced to a semantic HTML template that you can use for building web pages. Good luck. Social networks are a great tool to share content with friends and family, and even with co-workers and business partners. When you share a link, most social networks generate a preview of the link to let users know what the linked web page is about. Now that you're learning more about front-end web development, you're probably wondering how social networks generate these previews. In this video, you will learn how meta tags help web pages create previews of other web pages. By using meta tags to control what information is displayed to users, you can get more clicks when you share your websites. But the meta tags web developers use for this purpose are different from the traditional SEO meta tags that you learned about earlier in this lesson. Traditional SEO meta tags are oriented toward search results, not direct links. Facebook's rapid growth led to millions of people sharing thousands of links every day. To improve the user experience, they had to find a way to display information about a website before a user clicks on the link. To address this challenge, Facebook established the Open Graph protocol in 2010. The Open Graph protocol is a set of metadata rules that allow web pages to describe themselves to social networks. There are many metadata options available within the protocol, But before you learn about them, let's first discuss how the Open Graph Protocol metadata is defined. Earlier in this lesson, you learned that meta tags are defined inside of the head element of a HTML document. The Open Graph Protocol also uses meta tags added to the head element, but they are slightly different. Instead of the name attribute, the Open Graph Protocol uses the property attribute to define the metadata name. Then, like the regular meta tags, it uses the content attribute to define the metadata value. Each property in the Open Graph Protocol starts with OG: as a convention to identify it as an Open Graph Protocol related tag. The Open Graph Protocol requires that you must always include 4 properties on a web page. These are title, type, URL, and image. The title property defines the title of the page. This is the text that will appear in the preview. The type property defines the type of content, such as website, video, music, or article. Depending on the value you specify as the type, other properties may be required. You will learn about these in a later video. The URL property defines the permanent web address that the social network must use for the specific page. The image property defines a URL to an image that must display when the website is shared. Together, these Open Graph Protocol properties enable social media platforms to create a preview of the shared web link. Say you share a blog post. The title of the post is the OG title, the blog post URL is the OG URL, and the image that displays is the OG image. There are several other optional properties that you will learn more about later, but let's briefly explore 3 of these. The description property provides a description of the web page. The locale property describes the language and territory of the web page's content. For example, EN_US specifies that the page is in English and the locale is the United States. And the site name property describes the name of the overall website that the web page belongs to. You've now learned how to use metadata to describe web pages so that social networks can improve user experience by previewing shared content. Next time you share a website on a social network, you can use what you've learned about Open Graph Protocol properties to generate more clicks. Little Lemon Restaurant has hired a marketing firm to help them advertise their business. The firm recommends that the restaurant run a social media campaign. So the owners of the restaurant asked me to make sure that the website is ready to be shared on different social media platforms. Now let's examine how to prepare a web page so it can be linked on social media platforms. I've opened index.html in Visual Studio Code. At a minimum, I need to add 4 pieces of metadata required by the protocol. To do this, I add the 4 meta tags inside the head element. On the first meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:title. I then add the content attribute and set its value to our menu. This metadata is the title that will be displayed in the preview on the social media platform. It's important to note that this value should reflect the content of the individual web page and not the website as a whole. On the second meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:type. I then add the content attribute and set its value to website. This metadata informs the social platforms that this content being shared is a website. On the third meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:image. I then add the content attribute and set its value to logo.png. This metadata informs the social media platform what the preferred preview image is. In this case, it will be good to display the Little Lemon Restaurant logo. On the last meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:URL. I then add the content attribute and set its value to the URL of the Little Lemon website. The web page is now ready to be shared on social media platforms. However, there is some optional metadata I can add to provide additional information to the platforms. Since the platforms vary in what they display to their users, it's best to provide as much information as possible. I'll add 3 more meta tags to the head element. On the first tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:description. I then add the content attribute and set its value to Little Lemon is a family-owned Mediterranean restaurant focused on traditional recipes served with a modern twist. If the social media platform displays a description of the page when it is shared, this text will be displayed to inform the users what the web page is about. On the second tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:locale. I then add the content attribute and set its value to EN_US. This will inform the social media platforms that the locale of the website is US English. On the last tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to og:site_name. I then add the content attribute and set its value to Little Lemon. Some social media platforms will also display the website name beside the page title, so this will ensure that the website title is correct. The Little Lemon website is now ready for its big social media campaign. Hopefully, this will lead to lots of new customers. In this video, you've explored a practical example of how to add Open Graph Protocol metadata. You should now know how to add the 4 required meta tags: title, type, image, and URL. You also learned how to add additional meta tags that provide extra information, like the website description and locale. Well done. You've most likely encountered forms when registering an account on a website or when filling out your address for something you've bought online. As a developer, you'll use HTML forms to capture user input. Capturing input is one thing, but the form also needs to ensure the data is usable. How can you ensure the user input is valid? For example, let's say you are building an online food delivery website. Say a user accidentally makes an error when entering the delivery address and the form accepts it, although the location does not exist. It will cause a very bad user experience when the food never arrives. This is where form validation comes in. Form validation is a process that ensures that the data entered by the user in a form is valid and conforms to rules defined by the developer. There are 2 methods of form validation: client-side validation and server-side validation. Client-side validation checks for errors as soon as they are typed into the form. This is done by the web browser or by JavaScript code and provides the user with immediate feedback. The client-side validation process starts by checking if a form has been filled out correctly. If there are no errors, the form will be submitted to the server for processing. However, if there are errors, an error message will alert the user of the invalid data and how to change it for successful submission. For example, you decide to use the input element with its type attribute set to email. If the user does not enter a valid email address, the web browser will display an error message informing them that the data they entered is not a valid email address. On the other hand, server-side validation checks for errors after the data has been submitted to the web server. Server-side validation is more secure because it prevents malicious users from tampering with your website's code and submitting invalid data to your server. When the form data is received by the web server, the backend will validate the data before processing it. This validation can run more complex checks, such as checking the data against a database or validating the data against business requirements. Most websites use both client-side and server-side validation to provide immediate feedback to users, but also to protect against malicious data submission and to ensure data integrity. Let's examine how HTML allows you to do simple client-side validation. HTML has several input types that are validated by the web browser. As demonstrated in the example, email is used for email addresses. Others include tel for telephone numbers, URL for URLs such as www.meta.com, date for date values, time for time values, number for numeric values, range for numeric values which have a minimum and maximum value, and color for color selection. Say, for instance, a user makes mistakes on a user account form when entering a telephone number and a URL. The browser will validate the entered data against the requirements of the input type and provide user feedback. Another example is the required attribute, which indicates that the user must supply a value to an input field. The web browser will alert a user if a required value is outstanding. And that's the basics of client and server-side validation of forms. You'll learn more about HTML validation capabilities later in this lesson.
The Little Lemon restaurant wants to expand its service by taking online orders to deliver food to customers at home. To do this, they need their customers to set up an account on their website. In this video, you will learn how to create a simple sign-up form for user accounts on the Little Lemon website. I have set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named signup.html. I start off by adding the form element. The restaurant requires that the customer data is sent securely, so I will set the method attribute to post so that it is submitted using an HTTP post request. You will learn more about different methods of form submission later. For now, you just need to know that if you send a form via an HTTP post request, it improves the data security of the form. The restaurant wants to collect the customer's first name, last name, and email address. Of course, the form also needs a field for the password and another to confirm the password, so I need to create a form with 5 fields in total. I'll start by adding the input elements, also known as the form fields. First, I'll set up 6 div elements, 1 for each input element and 1 for the sign up button. The div elements will cause each field of the form to display in its own CSS block. Now I'll start adding the input elements. I add an input element for the first name to the first div element. Since the user will input plain text for this form field, I set the type attribute to text. I also set the name and ID attributes to user first name. Remember that the name attribute sets the key for the value submitted to the web server. Later in this video, I will explain why I set the ID attribute. Next, I add an input element for the last name. Like the first name element, I set the type attribute to text and the name and ID attributes to user last name. I then add an input element for the email address. To make sure users enter a valid email address in this field, I set the type attribute to email. Earlier you learned that doing so establishes HTML's client-side validation. I also set the name and ID attributes to user email. Next, I add the input element for the password. I want the password to be hidden on screen as the user types it, so I set the type attribute to password. When an input field is set to password, each character that a user enters will display as a placeholder character, such as a bullet point. The content in the field will contain the password that the user enters, but it will be hidden. I then set the name and ID attributes to user password. Finally, I add the input element for confirming the password. Again, I set the type to password to hide the content of the input field on screen. I then set the name and ID attributes to user confirm password. Now that our input fields are set up, I save the file and open the live preview to check the web page. Everything displays correctly. However, I'd like to improve the user experience by informing the user what each field represents. To do this, I'll add a label element before each input element. And now I want to explain why I set the ID attribute for each input field earlier in the video. The reason for this is that it allows me to associate a label with each input element. Labels improve the user experience and assist accessibility software in understanding the form. I now add a label element above the first input element. Inside the label element, I add the descriptive text for the input field. In this case, the text description will be first name. Then, to associate the label with the input field, I add the for attribute and set its value to match the value of the ID attribute of the input element. Finally, I'll add a line break tag after the label element so that the input field displays below the label. I then repeat the same process for each input element. I save the file again and open the live preview. Ah yes, that's much better. The form labels now display above the input fields. To finalize the form, I need to add one more thing, the Submit button. Inside the last div element, I add a button element. I set the button type attribute to Submit. Then inside the button element, I add the text Sign Up. I save the file again and open the live preview. The form is now ready to use. Once the backend is set up by a backend developer to accept the data submitted via the form, users will be able to create their accounts. In this video, you learned how to create a basic form with several different input fields, each in its own CSS block. You covered how to set the method attribute to submit the form in a secure way. And you also now know how to associate a label with an input field to improve the user experience. Good luck with creating your own sign-up forms.
Have you ever completed a form online and then after you've clicked on the Submit button, one of the fields turned red? There are many reasons for error messages when you complete online forms. The format could be wrong, but sometimes an error results when a field is empty or if a value is too long or too short. As a developer, you can use HTML and CSS to guide users to enter the correct data on forms and in this way save web server resources. In this video, you will learn more about the capabilities of client-side validation in HTML and how to use CSS to effectively alert users when data is incorrect. By now, you've learned about the different HTML input types and how they validate the format of data. But there are additional attributes that you can apply to elements for further validation. First, let's explore how you can ensure that the user provides a value to a form field. This example of a login form contains two fields, one for the username and one for the password. It also contains a submit button to submit the form. If a user hasn't added a username or password and clicks the submit button, the browser will allow the form to submit to the web server. But this is a waste of server resources. Because although the server-side validation will pick up the missing information and prevent the processing of the request, a HTTP request was still submitted. Let's improve this form by using client-side validation to ensure the user enters values to both fields. Now, with the required attribute in the code, if one of the fields is empty and the user clicks the submit button, the request will not be submitted to the web server. The web browser will focus on the first empty input element and inform the user that a field is empty. Now the form creates a much better user experience and prevents unnecessary usage of web server resources. But user input that is too short or too long would also result in unnecessary submissions to the web server. So another way to validate user input is to specify the required length for data. Let's say you want the usernames to be at least 3 characters long and a maximum of 12 characters. Or maybe you want to ensure more secure passwords by requiring a minimum password length of 5 characters. Fortunately, there are 2 more attributes you can use to ensure the correct length of data. You can add the min length and max length attributes to the fields to specify the required length. In this case, since the minimum value for the username is set to 3, a 2-character entry would be invalid. If you click the Submit button now, the web browser will inform you of the length requirements. A built-in function of the browser will generate the message displayed on screen. Again, a much better user experience and management of web server resources. Now let's focus on the way the browser communicates errors to the users, like a form field that turns red when the data is invalid. This can be readily implemented using CSS. To highlight a field in red when the data is invalid, you use the input element selector. You then apply the pseudo-class selector called invalid. You will learn more about pseudo-class selectors later in this course. For now, the key thing to know is that they are used to select elements based on their state, such as whether the input data is valid or invalid. And then you add a CSS property to set the border of the element to red. But since all the form fields are empty when the form loads initially, their state is still practically invalid. This will cause all form fields to display red from the start, like demonstrated in this real-world example of a login screen. Ideally, you only want fields to appear red as the user enters invalid data. To do this, you need to apply another pseudo class called focus, which checks if the user is currently entering data into this field. Now the form will appear normal when the page first loads. And when the user starts inputting data, the field will turn red if the data is invalid. This video gave you a brief introduction to how you can use client-side validation and CSS pseudo-class selectors to improve the user experience of forms. As you learn more about JavaScript in other courses, you will be able to use even more advanced techniques to improve form validation. You've surely booked something online before. Perhaps it was tickets to a show or accommodation for a holiday. The ability to book things online is super convenient. That's one of the reasons why the Little Lemon restaurant is adding a table booking system to their website. By now, you should know that a HTML form will be an ideal solution for that. Like most restaurants, Little Lemon has different table sizes and different sections in the restaurant where customers can be seated. Therefore, the HTML form must allow customers to decide between the available table sizes, as well as if they want to sit indoors or outdoors. Since both choices have limited options available, it will be best to use radio buttons for the input. Radio buttons are ideal for this form because they allow me to set up groups of options of which only one option in the group can be selected. Now let's explore how to set up a HTML form with radio buttons. I've opened Visual Studio Code and added a new file called booking.html. I've set up the basic HTML structure and added a form element. First, I'll add two field set elements, one for the table size and one for location. The field set element defines a group for the radio buttons. Without the field set elements, all radio buttons will belong to the same group, but for this form, we need two groups. On the first field set element, I set the ID attribute to size. On the second field set element, I set the ID attribute to location. Below the field set elements, I add a button element. On the button element, I set the type attribute to submit. Inside the element, I add the text book table. There are three different table sizes available at Little Lemon: 2-person, 4-person, and 6-person tables. Inside the first field set element, I add three input elements representing the three different table sizes. On the first input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to 2. I then set the name attribute to size. It is important to set the name attribute value to match the value of the ID attribute in the field set. This tells the browser which field set the input belongs to. After the element, I add the text 2-person table. On the second input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to 4. I then set the name attribute to size. After the element, I add the text 4-person table. Since the 4-person table is the most common booking, I want to have this option selected by default. To do this, I add the checked attribute to this input element. On the third input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to 6. I then set the name attribute to size. After the element, I add the text 6-person table. In the second field set element, I add two input elements representing the table location at the restaurant. On the first input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to indoors. I then set the name attribute to location, matching the ID of the second field set element. Since the indoor booking is the most common, I'll add the checked attribute to this input element so that it is selected by default. On the second input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to outdoors. Again, I set the name attribute to location. I save the file and open it in live preview. Success! The form is set up correctly. Let's test it. If I choose an option for the table size and then choose a different option, my previous choice is deselected. The table location field behaves the same. I can only choose indoors or outdoors. However, I'm testing this form on a laptop with a large screen. On a mobile device with a way smaller screen, it may be difficult for the user to accurately select the small button elements. Luckily, there is a way to improve this by setting the text and button as the input area. I open booking.html again. For each input element and text, I wrap them in a label element, which will group the text with the input element. I save the file again and return to live preview. If I click on the text now, the corresponding input element is selected. Selecting the desired choice will be much easier on a mobile device now. A user will be able to select the button specifically. This form has a much better user experience now. In this video, you've covered how to use radio buttons to create a simple online booking form. Hopefully, Little Lemon will get a lot more table bookings now. The Little Lemon restaurant is becoming very popular in their local area, so much so that a second Little Lemon restaurant opened in another nearby area. Because of this, they want to update their online booking form. They've also added some new table sizes to the restaurant, so they want to replace the table size field on the form with a field for the number of people instead. They also don't need the table location field anymore. And finally, they want customers to be able to choose which restaurant they want to book at. The owners of the restaurant hope for continued success and growth of the business, so the form should allow for more restaurant locations to be added as the business expands. To make all these improvements to the booking form, you'll need to learn how to add advanced HTML features to a form. And that is exactly what this video will cover. Let's explore how to add the calendar, range and data list input types. I open booking.html in Visual Studio Code. I'll start by deleting the previous table and location fields. I then add 3 div elements for the new fields. Next, I'll add the field for the booking date. Luckily, HTML provides a built-in field type called date that will present a calendar to the customer when the field is clicked. To add this, I add an input element to the first div element and set its type attribute to date. I also set the ID and name attributes to booking_date. To provide a good user experience, I'll add a label element before the input element. Inside the label element, I add the text description, booking date. I also add the for attribute and set its value to booking_date so that accessibility software can describe the purpose of the input field to its users. Next, I'll add the field for the number of people. The restaurant has told me that the maximum booking is 10 people, so I'll use the range input type. The range input type allows me to specify the minimum and maximum values of the field. I add an input element to the second div element. I set its type attribute to range. I also set its ID and name attributes to booking_people. To set the minimum value, I add the attribute min, which is short for minimum, and set its value to 1. Then, to set the maximum value, I add the attribute max, which is short for maximum, and set its value to 10. Since a 4-person booking is the most common, I'll set the value attribute to 4 so that it will be set to 4 when the form initially loads. But a slider isn't much use without displaying its value. I add an output element after the input element and set its text content to 4 to match the default value of the input element. The output element is a semantic HTML element that contains a result of a calculation. In this case, I want it to display the value of the slider. To do this, I'll add a small piece of JavaScript code to the input element. I add the onInput attribute and set its value to this.nextElement sibling.value equals this.value. This small piece of code will update the output element with the value of the slider when it changes. Again, to provide a good user experience, I add a label before the element and set its content to number of people. I then set the for attribute to booking_people. Now I'll add the new location field. The restaurant currently has 2 locations, but they said they might add more later. To allow for expansion later, I'll use a data list input type. The data list input type allows me to specify a list of available options that will appear in a drop-down list. There can be tens and hundreds of options, so the field allows the user to begin typing and it will narrow down the available options based on their input. Since there are only 2 locations so far, the customer will be able to select their location from the drop-down list. When more locations are added later, the customer will be able to begin typing their location and quickly select their location from a reduced set of options. Setting up the data list input type requires a few more steps than the other input types. First, I add an input element. Then I set the name and ID attributes to booking_location. Then I add an attribute called list and set its value to locations. This value is important for the next step. I then add a data list element and set the ID attribute to match the value of the list attribute on the input element. In this case, I set the ID attribute to locations. Inside the data list element, I then add 2 option elements. On the first option element, I add the value attribute and set it to downtown. On the second option element, I add the value attribute and set it to uptown. Again, to provide a good user experience, I add a label before the input element and set its content to location. I then set the for attribute to booking_location. I save the file and open it in live preview. When I click on the date field, the browser opens a calendar and allows me to select a date. The range input type is presented as a slider that I can slide left and right to the value I want. And finally, the data list input allows me to select an option for the location or begin typing to narrow down the available options. With the continued success of Little Lemon, I'm sure I'll be updating this form again in the near future. In this video, you've learned how to use advanced features of HTML forms. You should now be able to add a calendar, create a slider with values, and add a data list that allows users to either select an option from a drop-down list or by typing their input. When ordering products online, you fill out your address and your credit card number. Then you click on an order button that confirms your order. Because you are learning more about front-end development, you might be wondering what exactly happens when you click on that order button. In this video, you will learn what happens when forms are submitted in the web browser. By now, you know that the web browser communicates with a web server using a HTTP request response cycle. This means that the web browser sends requests to the web server and the web server sends back a response. Up to now, the main type of requests you've been introduced to were for resources such as HTML documents, images, CSS files, and JavaScript files. But it is also possible to send data as part of a request. This is how forms send data to the web server. In fact, there are two ways a form can send data to the web server, using the HTTP GET method or the HTTP POST method. You can specify which method the form should use with the method attribute of the form element. Let's examine an example form and see how the data can be sent using the two different methods. This login form accepts a username and password. It also has a login button that submits the form to the web server. So how would it work if the method attribute is set to GET? When the login button is clicked, the form data is sent as part of the request URL. This means that the user data is appended to the end of the URL in the web browser navigation bar. The web server receives the HTTP GET request and extracts the form data from the URL. While this is an easy way to submit data, it has three key problems. First, the length of a URL is limited to around 2,000 characters depending on the web browser you are using. Some web browsers allow more, but there are inconsistencies between browsers. So, if you have a large form, some data may be lost when it's sent via the GET method to the web server. Second, the length of a requested URL is also limited on some web servers. Popular web server software such as Apache Web Server or Nginx have a default limit of around 4,096 characters. So again, if you have a large form, some data may be lost. The final problem is security. Since the data is included as part of the URL, it means that your data is stored in your web browser history and possibly in the request logs on the web server. If you're transmitting personal information such as addresses or credit card numbers, this is a major privacy and security risk. Now let's focus on how the form would work if we set the method attribute to POST. When the form is submitted using the POST method, the form data is inserted into the content of the HTTP request. When the submit button is pressed, it will send an HTTP POST request with the data contained in the body of the request. The HTTP POST method is more secure than the HTTP GET method. However, the data could still be read by a third party listening to the HTTP request. To secure this completely, HTTPS is used to encrypt the data so that only the sender and receiver can understand the data. Once the web server receives the request, it processes it and sends back a HTTP response. If the request was successful, the response will direct the web browser to a new web page. If errors occurred, there are many ways this can be handled by the web page, as explained in a previous video. You should now be familiar with how forms are sent to web servers and the difference between GET and POST. An important part of being a front-end developer is to provide a good user experience on the websites and web applications that you develop. And that includes ensuring that users can complete HTML forms without issues. There are many web browsers available today for browsing the World Wide Web. However, each one is developed by a different company using different technologies. As a result, you will find that your HTML forms will appear differently when you view them on different web browsers. But a form may even appear differently on the same browser when you view the form on a Windows PC or a Mac. This makes the creation of a consistent user experience challenging. In this video, you will explore how form elements display differently on various web browsers and how to solve this problem. First, let's focus on the most common form element, the input element. The same input type HTML code displays differently in web browsers such as Firefox, Microsoft Edge, Chrome, and Safari. For example, there are subtle differences in the height and corners of the input box. There is also a difference in the default input box widths of Firefox and Safari compared to other browsers like Microsoft Edge and Chrome. Safari on Mac OS differs a lot from the other browsers, using a thinner border and regular corners. Next, let's explore the checkbox input type. Again, the exact same input type HTML code will let the checkbox display differently in a checked and unchecked state in different browsers. Notice that Microsoft Edge uses a grey colour in the checked state while the other web browsers use blue. Even still, each browser is using a different shade of blue. Also notice how the border of the checkbox varies between each web browser. Safari's checkbox is also smaller than the other. Now that you've explored how HTML form elements can appear inconsistently across different web browsers, let's focus on how to solve this. As you know, CSS allows you to define the visual styling of HTML elements. Defining CSS rules for the different HTML form elements will ensure that your element is styled consistently across web browsers. For example, you can use element selectors to select the different element types and apply CSS properties to them. It's also possible to style the individual input types using CSS rules. You can add a CSS rule using the element selector. To select the input HTML element, use the input element selector. And then specify the individual styling by adding a pair of square brackets, and then type equals, in this case, text or email. Then apply CSS properties to set the font, width, height, and border. If you specify styling with CSS in this way, the individual elements of your forms will display consistently across browsers. Luckily, there are a lot of resources that simplify the styling of forms. Popular libraries and frameworks such as Bootstrap, Tailwind CSS, and Foundation provide CSS rules for forms and ensure visual consistency across different devices and browsers. You should now know why it is important to pay attention to the appearance of different HTML elements across web browsers and how you can ensure consistency with CSS rules. These days, it's difficult to think of using the internet without streaming music or videos, but this wasn't always possible on the World Wide Web. How do you, as a developer, add videos and audio to a web page? Luckily, it's quite straightforward, thanks to HTML and modern web browsers. HTML video and audio tags are used for embedding media on a web page, and both tags support different file types that can be played in the web browser. For videos, the following file types are supported by most web browsers: MP4, WebM, and OGG. For audio, the following file types are supported by most web browsers: MP3, WAV, and OGG. Let's examine how to use the video tag. You start with the video tag itself. Then you add a source element. Note that the source element has no closing tag. In the source element, you add two attributes: src, also known as source, and type. In the src attribute, you add the address of the video file. In this case, it's linked to a file named dance.mp4. In the type attribute, you add the value video/mp4 since the file is an mp4 file. Remember I mentioned that the file types are supported by most web browsers. In case the file type is not supported, the video tag allows for multiple sources to be specified. The web browser will check through the sources and use the first one that it supports. If you prefer the web browser to use one format over another, then make sure to specify them in the preferred order. There are also attributes available for the video tag itself, which allow you to customize the video player. For example, you can specify the width and height of the player using the width and height attributes. If you want to enable player controls, such as a pause and volume button, you can add the controls attribute. There are other attributes available to customize the video player too. You'll learn more about these in a later video. Now let's examine how the audio tag works. Similar to the video tag, you start with the opening and closing audio tags. And just like the video tag, you specify the source element with its src and type attributes. And if the web browser doesn't support the file type, it can fall back on a different type. It's important to note that if you're using an MP3 file, that the type is specified as audio/MPEG. This is because MP3 is short for MPEG-1 audio layer 3. Like the video player, you can also customize the audio player. By using the controls attribute, you can enable player controls such as the pause and volume buttons. And now you know how to add and customize both a video player and an audio player. Well done! You'll learn about other video and audio attributes in the next video.
The Little Lemon restaurant wants to add an About page to their website. They've asked me to set up the page and include some audio and video in embedded players. I've set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named about.html. I start off by adding the heading tag containing the text About. I then add a paragraph element containing the About text provided to me by the restaurant. Next, I add the audio element after the paragraph element. Inside the audio element, I add the source element and set the src attribute to music.ogg. Then I set the type attribute to audio/OGG. They also ask that the audio should loop, so when the audio player reaches the end of the audio, it should automatically go back and play it again from the start. To do this, I add the loop attribute to the audio element. I also need to add controls so that the user can play and pause the audio. To do this, I add the controls attribute to the audio element. I save the file and open the web page in my browser. I can see that the audio is loading and is displayed in the browser using the browser's built-in audio player. Pressing the play button starts the audio, and pressing pause will pause it. Everything is working as expected. Now I'll add the video. I add a video element before the paragraph element. Inside the video element, I add the source element and set the src attribute to video.mp4. I then set the type attribute to video/mp4. I want to reserve the appropriate amount of space on the web page for the video, so I go back to the video element and set the width attribute to 320 and the height attribute to 240. To provide a good user experience, I'll also enable the video controls. To do this, I add the controls attribute to the video element. I save the file again and open the page in my browser. The video appears and I can click on the play button to start the video. However, the restaurant requested that the audio of the video should be disabled by default. To do this, I go back to my HTML and add the muted attribute to the video element. I save the file again and open the page. And everything is working as expected. That's great. The About page is a great addition to the Little Lemon website for customers wanting to learn more about the business. Using embedded players is a good way to make your web page more interactive. And luckily, these players can support either audio or video. What's more, you can add controls to allow the user to decide what they want to do. These audio and video players are sure to grab customers' attention when they browse the About page.
Have you ever visited a website with a map, video, or social media post contained in the web page? Now that you're learning about HTML, you may have wondered how that's done. Well, it's done using something called an iframe. An iframe is a HTML element that allows you to place or embed content from another website into a web page. It's defined using the iframe HTML tag. How it works is that it embeds another browsing instance inside the page. What this means is that it runs the embedded web page similar to how a web page runs in another tab of your web browser. Therefore, it's running the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript of the embedded web page. An iframe is often used to display adverts, but it can also be used to embed content from another website, such as a social media post. The content that's embedded is defined using the src attribute. The value of the attribute is the URL of the content. It's also possible to set the width and height of an iframe using the width and height attributes. While iframe is very useful, its security has been a concern since its inception because it's vulnerable to malicious code and injection. As previously mentioned, a web page can run JavaScript code, so it's important to ensure that you trust the website you're embedding into your own. Fortunately, there are some attributes that can be applied to limit the behavior of the iframe. The first attribute is the allow attribute, which limits which browser features the iframe can access. There are many possible values that can be set on the allow attribute. For now, let's examine how to disable camera and microphone access in an iframe. On your iframe element, you add the allow attribute and set its value to camera none and microphone none. Now that was easy. The second attribute to improve security is the sandbox attribute. Similar to the allow attribute, there are many values that can be set. The sandbox attribute limits behavior within the iframe, such as preventing files from being downloaded and preventing pop-up windows. For now, the important thing to know is that when the sandbox attribute is used with an empty value, all sandbox restrictions will apply to the iframe. Individual sandbox restrictions can be removed by adding attributes. For example, if you want to allow file downloads in the iframe, you would allow the allow downloads value. While these restrictions help to keep your users secure, there may still be security vulnerabilities in your web browser that the embedded web page can exploit. Therefore, it's always best to be cautious when using iframes and ensure that you trust the website that you are embedding.
The Little Lemon restaurant has partnered with another restaurant for cross-promotional purposes. The other restaurant wants to be able to change the images in the campaign throughout the coming year based on their current promotions. To support this, I've been asked to set up an iframe on the main page of the website. The other restaurant specifically asked for an iframe to be used because it means that they can update their promotional image on the Little Lemon website without needing to contact me first. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to do that. I've opened index.html in Visual Studio Code. First, I add the iframe element. The other restaurant didn't provide the URL for the promotional image, so for now, I'll embed a placeholder image that they did provide. To do this, I add an src attribute to the iframe element and set its value to placeholder.png. The image will always be 320 pixels by 128 pixels in size, so I'll need to set the iframe to the same size. I add the width attribute to the iframe element and set its value to 320. I then add the height attribute and set its value to 128. I save the file and open it in the web browser. The image is correctly placed on the web page. When the other restaurant provides the final URL of the advertisement, I can update the src attribute of the element. However, the Little Lemon restaurant has expressed security concerns about embedding content, especially now that they have online ordering and customers interacting with their website. Their concerns are valid, as there are many security vulnerabilities with embedding content from another website. To address these concerns, I've decided to sandbox and limit the capabilities of the iframe element. I open my index.html file again. I then add the sandbox attribute to the iframe element. This will prevent any JavaScript files running within the iframe and restrict many browser capabilities within the iframe context, such as submitting forms and allowing pop-up windows. Next, I'll add the allow attribute. The allow attribute accepts multiple values, and the values are separated by semicolons. I want to disable several browser features for the iframe. These include payment, microphone, and camera access. In the allow attribute, I first add the word payment followed by a space character, then a single quote, the word none, and another single quote to disable payments. I then add a semicolon. Next, I add the word camera and again a space followed by the word none in single quotes. This will disable camera access. I then add another semicolon. Finally, I add the word microphone and again add a space followed by the word none in single quotes. This will disable microphone access. I save the file and open it in the web browser. Great, the iframe still works, and it's now more secure. The iframe I created is now secure thanks to the restrictions I've placed on it. First, I added the sandbox attribute to restrict certain browser capabilities, and then I used the allow attribute to disable some potentially unsecured browser features. Now that they know it's secure, the other restaurant is going to implement the same code on their website. Hopefully, this will lead to a lot more business for both restaurants.
You've most likely played a video game or watched an animation in your web browser before. Perhaps you've wondered how it works. Well, in this video, you'll be introduced to the basics of graphics programming in the web browser. There are many authoring tools available to produce animated and video game content for the web browser, but all of these are underpinned by one of four technologies: GIF, WebP, 2D Canvas, and WebGL. The graphics interchange format, or GIF, along with the WebP image format are used for animated images. An image using this format has no interactivity, but is popular for embedding animated content and for building 2D video games and animations. The 2D Canvas allows 2D graphics to be drawn in the web browser. It's popular for building 2D video games and animations. The logic and behavior of an animation or video game is defined using JavaScript. But what about 3D graphics? WebGL is a popular technology for building 2D and 3D animations and advanced graphics. The benefit of WebGL is that a dedicated chip in your device, called a graphics processing unit, or GPU, does the calculations when graphics are rendered to the screen. This allows for complex calculations such as lighting simulation and rendering massive 3D worlds. It is important to note that while WebGL will always use the GPU, it's not guaranteed that the 2D Canvas will use the GPU. This will depend on the web browser implementation. WebGL is a complex technology and requires a lot of background information. So for now, let's focus on the Canvas element. Let's examine how to animate some simple graphics using the 2D Canvas. I'm going to animate a bouncing ball. I've opened Visual Studio Code and I've set up two files, index.html and animation.js. Inside index.html, I have added the Canvas HTML element. I have set its width attribute to 640 and its height attribute to 480. I have also set its ID attribute to my_canvas so that I can access the element in my JavaScript code. After the Canvas element, I have a script element with its src attribute set to animation.js. I now open animation.js. At the beginning of the file, I look up the Canvas element using the document.get element by ID function and pass in my _canvas at the parameter. The result is stored in a variable named canvas. Next, I look up the 2D Canvas context using canvas.getContext and pass in the parameter 2D. The result is stored in a variable named context. Below this, I define some variables to track the speed, position, movement, and radius of the bouncing ball. Next, I define a function called moveBall. It is responsible for moving the ball across the screen and changing its direction once it reaches the left or right side of the screen. After that, I define a function called drawBall. The function clears the canvas area using context.clearRec. It then draws the ball in its current position using the context.beginPath, context.arc, and context.fill functions. Finally, I define an animate function, which calls the moveBall and drawBall functions. After doing this, it then calls window.requestAnimationFrame to schedule the animate function to be called again. At the end of the file, I call window.requestAnimationFrame to start the animate function being called. Using a small amount of JavaScript code, I've animated a bouncing ball. This is a straightforward example of the capabilities of the 2D Canvas. There are many more possibilities to develop animations in video games, and there are also many libraries available to simplify development. These are linked in the additional resources reading. You've reached the end of this module on HTML. It's now time to review what you've learned in these lessons. You began this module by exploring the question, how is HTML and CSS used in the real world? You learned about the role of a HTML and CSS developer, what entry-level jobs and career paths are available to you, and what a day in the life of a developer looks like, and who you'd work with as a HTML and CSS developer. You also learned what the relationship is between HTML and CSS, how HTML and CSS are continually improving, and how HTML and CSS usage has gone beyond desktop PCs. Next, you learned about semantic and meta tags. You should now be able to recognize how and why semantic tags are used, use basic semantic tags, and have an appreciation of the structured approach needed to produce a well-formed web page. You also explored the topics of metadata and meta tags using templates, layout design, and social media cards. Following your exploration of these topics, you should now be able to explain why metadata and meta tags are used, add basic Open Graph Protocol meta tags to HTML documents, and demonstrate the application of the OG protocol when setting up a social media card. You then moved on to study user input and forms. This topic included learning about forms and validation, client-side validation, form submission, radio buttons, and browser differences. You learned how to create and test a basic form, identify the potential of HTML validation types, and explain how forms send data to the web server. In addition, you should now be able to demonstrate the use of radio buttons and explain how to ensure that forms display consistently across browsers. Following this introduction to user input and forms, you then covered media elements. This topic included video and audio, embedded players, iframes, and the canvas element. You should now be able to embed video and audio in a web page, create a video and audio player that can rate the media played, recognize the purpose of the iframe tag and learn to identify and mitigate security risks when using the iframe tag, and identify the uses of the canvas element. You should now be familiar with the basics of HTML. You now know more about the role of a HTML and CSS developer and the kinds of things you'll be doing when working as one, like using semantic tags to construct a well-formed web page, or how to use inputs and forms or embed videos and audio. Well done, you're making good progress on your learning journey.